Hello out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are really happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to blow more oxygen on the growing tools for thinking sector, addressing key issues and talking with the people who are doing the work. This podcast is created by BetaWorks, a New York City-based startup studio. I'm Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper. Our topic today is data structures that improve tools for thinking. Our guests are Paul Roni, founder of Kosmik, Alex Obenauer, the founder of MindSense, and John Underkoffler, a gesture UI pioneer you may recognize from our third episode on space, pixels, and cognition. There was just a moment where it made a lot of sense to invite John into this conversation, and he has sort of free license to jump in and so forth. But with that, I would love just, Paul, if you could just tell us a little bit of the story of what you're doing and how you got there.
Yeah, so nice to meet you all. So I'm Paul, I'm the founder of Kosmik. Kosmik is a spatial web browser or a spatial tool for thoughts based on an infinite canvas where you can drag and drop any kind of data from text to web pages to PDFs. And the nice thing about Kosmik is that it's based on a database called Foundation that we've also developed based on IPFS, so a decentralized file system. And that decentralized file system allows us to implement features in the canvas that make sense, like backlinking, linking, transclusion. So the idea that an object can live in two spaces at the same time and be edited by several people while maintaining this sync of data. And we do think that it was for us essential to build that database to make the UI shine. We see more and more visual canvas, but if we do not change the underlying structure, it will be difficult to take them kind of in a more, I would say, hard direction and beyond the simple whiteboarding. So that's kind of what we do. We do the database and that new spatial UI for iPad, for the Mac, and for the web.
Sounds great. Thank you, Paul. And just IPFS, the interplanetary file system by itself is a juicy and interesting topic. And right away, there's this sort of tension between sophisticated data structures, but distributed data management. And so IPFS wins you the distributed data part, but then you still have to solve the other pieces of it. Alex, you've been wrestling with these issues as well. Could you give us a little trail for how you got here?
Yeah, for sure. So my primary work is independent research in the future of personal computing. It's primarily shaped by exploring, the OS of the future. What does that look like, and how should that work? I document this work in my lab notes on my personal website. It's primarily looking at trying to figure out what is the mental model that we have when we're interacting with our digital things, and it's not apps. An app is a metaphor, but that doesn't necessarily fit into our mental models very well. So what are those mental models with which we think, with which we do personal computing, and can we put together the primitives to interact with on our personal computing devices more fluidly, so that we can more closely represent our thinking within our personal computing domain, that kind of thing.
Thanks, Alex. And at various points in time, I've often thought a little bit about, and I am no information architect or coder, but I've often thought about sort of the difference between databases, operating systems, applications, and where does data lie? And could we somehow just treat files sprinkled across the file system as a distributed data set and infer database operations and other kinds of things on them? I think we're going to walk through some of that as we open the conversation, but I love the thing that you're focused on. And John, could you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Well, that's going to start sounding redundant because we did that back in episode 3, but I'm I guess a lifelong bemoaner of the lack of advancement in UI being that most fundamental of all computational experiences, the one piece of the computer we can actually touch, see, smell, that is computation for us. And for better or much, much worse, I think the sort of emergence of the internet, but really the web around 94, distracted en masse the entire CS world to the extent that I watched grad school get kind of hollowed out as everyone went off to start a web-based startup and so forth. But more importantly and more deleteriously, that mass diversion meant that people were no longer developing new UIs. And it seemed to me that 1984, from the Macintosh UI to 94, a decade, was about what we should expect a healthy kind of general UI to last. And then, the sole is all full of holes and the shoe leather's falling apart and it's time to get a new shoe. But instead, we got the web and we got stuck with this desktop UI. So I think we're sort of 35 years in an oubliette, in a pit, and I'm hoping to stack up some little pebbles to help climb our way out. I've put examples of some of the ways we might do that in films that I've been very, very, very fortunate indeed to be able to participate in the design of, like Minority Report and Iron Man and Aeon Flux and so forth. But most of the time I spend my life building examples. And I'll just say that I'm really excited to speak with all of you today. The podcast and the kind of growing tide of interest in these topics, out of which the podcast comes, makes me feel a little less lonely.
I love that. Thank you, John. And you're reminding me that in episode 3, where you were our guest, I brought in this notion that the desktop metaphor has sort of all sorts of applications in a tractor beam, because every application needs users, and users are really familiar with the Office suite and the desktop metaphor. So every interesting application gets tugged in that way. I'm including that by reference here. If anybody would like to go deeper into that, go back and listen to episode 3. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so no, I was just to rebound on the desktop metaphor. One thing that to me the fundamental problem with that metaphor is not the fact that we try to create a virtual desktop, but the problem is that as OSs evolved, like as we got from macOS 1, System 1 to macOS 9 to macOS 10 to where we are right now, we diluted the power of that metaphor. I'm going to give a few examples that to me are very, very like users do not see them, but they actually make the mental model way, way worse. So for example, in System 1, when you double click on a folder on macOS, it will open a new window. That window had metadata that would store its size, its position on the screen of the computer. And if that folder contained a subfolder and you double clicked on that, it would not refresh the content of the window as macOS 10 is doing today. It would open a new window with its own coordinates, its own size, and you could create arrangement of windows spatially. So the Finder was actually a spatial metaphor. It was not an infinite canvas in any way, but it has that idea of a trail that you could follow and where you could find your files very easily. And we lost that with macOS. And as we go, especially with the new version that came out yesterday, it's worse and worse because Windows will not even remember the preset. Like, would you like an icon arrangement, a grid arrangement, a list arrangement, or a columnar arrangement? Like, we completely lost that. And the other thing that goes even before the Macintosh was that the desktop as a metaphor was active. So if you look at the work that was done at the Park, and if you look at a computer like the Dorado, the Alto, or even closer than us and commercially available, the Xerox Star, on the desktop, you had icons, like you had a printer, you had an outbox and an inbox. And there is something that is, to me, very, very significant in the app orienting paradigm that we have today. Today, if I want to send you an email, I have to open an email client or go to a mail provider, type an email, and that email will be stuck in that program, or I can copy and paste, but let's set that aside. I'm going to send it to you. Whereas on the Xerox computers, you could just open a text editor, type your mail, it would have an icon on the desktop, and you were just drag and dropping that into the in or out basket, and it would get distributed. Or you were drag and dropping that on the printer icon, and it would get printed out. So the desktop was actually functioning not only as a file organizer, but really as a space to create and to manage work. And so we lost that. And to me, this is the fundamental problem today. Like, we lean too much on the file metaphor, on the desktop metaphor as just a file browser. Like, we made the desktop dumb. And the work we do revolves mainly around that and on how could we do away with files. Like, maybe you want to cut me there because it's already very long, but another thing that I'm really, really kind of please pardon my English sometimes because I'm French, so I may not use the right word all the times, but something that I'm kind of pissed off about is how the iPad is handling files. Like, if you look at the iPhone and the iPad, they are not app-oriented. The Mac is app-oriented, but you can still open a file in different apps. Actually, that's one of the magical thing about the Mac. And the Mac will just pick for you which app is the best translator. That's how they were called before macOS 10. On the iPad, I would call the iPad a container-oriented computer, which is that you have apps that contains their data. And because it became so tedious to organize, because you had to handle files in each app, you had to manage that in the app itself. Like the iPad is really app-oriented, and I would say container-oriented, because the files themselves are trapped into the app. So Apple came out with the Files app in, I think it was iPadOS 8 or 11. And the Files app is just a dumber and harder to use Finder that has an even worse metaphor, because you cannot even organize it visually. And so now the magic of the iPad, which should have been to say, we hit the file system, we have a data pool, and apps are just going to talk to that data pool, was completely lost because of that.
Love that. So from what you started saying, I should not upgrade to Ventura?
Sorry. Depends on what you want your computer to look and behave.
Exactly. But you're also describing this historic trail that I hadn't noticed that much. And I'm aware of Xerox Star, but I've never sat down at one. And so this progression and as you're saying, sort of weakening of the metaphors is super, super interesting.
If I may, actually, I think that
Please.
with your permission, Paul, and maybe this is,
go ahead.
Maybe we can carom the hockey puck off my face to Alex, because I bet he has a bunch to say about this also. But it feels to me like the original sin is even farther back than the dilution of the Macintosh metaphor. The original sin lies in the difference between the Smalltalk environments, the Smalltalk GUI environments of Xerox PARC, and the Macintosh version, where in the Macintosh version, there's no direct efficacy, no direct agency on the part of the user. All you can do is open apps and use the apps. In the Smalltalk environment, you've got a GUI, you can build apps, but there's always a code editor right there. There's always a transcript window where you can directly manipulate the substance of the machine, and that's trapped behind, or it's occluded deliberately behind, a layer of abstraction that the Mac UI gave us, and that we've been making that blast shield thicker and thicker and thicker, which with each passing year, until, as you say, with Android and iOS, they've worked really hard to pretend that files don't even exist. And of course they do. You can't get away from it, and the underlying OSs have it, which is why you have to eventually introduce the files. So the files metaphor, the files mental model for what's happening down there is, at least for me, way, way better than there aren't really files and it's sort of magic, but we're not going to help you understand what the magic is idea that mobile devices try to foist on us.
Alex, the puck is in your rectangle.
Yeah, the original sin, I definitely look at that exact spot as the original sin. So a lot of I'm constantly designing new things into my fictitious or semi-real OSs of the future. One of the big ones is non-volatile workspaces. You gather together a bunch of different things that you need to do some line of work, or you follow some train of thought and it causes a number of different things to be, on your screen, and you have them arranged in some capacity. That's some amount of work. You restart your computer, that work is completely lost. You have to redo it. So a non-volatile workspace, is, kind of intuitive at this point, right? The idea that I should be able to return to a workspace, have all my items that I had up, arranged the way I had them. And it turns out that was a part of the, if I understand correctly, original GUI desktop idea, that you would have kind of multiple, I don't know if they were called multiple desktops at that point, but that you would, have different workspaces, and you could flip from your kind of office workspace to your home workspace, and it would keep all your, all your window, all your files, all your things would be open as you left them. And so we lost it every time. I feel like and so whenever I describe my work on my website, I say new and renewed ideas, because I constantly find 90% of what I put of the new thinking that I put in to my work, it was there, and often at Xerox PARC.
So many good ideas were dropped in the world way back when, including Doug Engelbart's famous Mother of All Demos, which was very multi-user. right? And then when these things get commercialized, they get dumbed down, they get broken, they get, both Gates and Jobs had to be blackmailed and coerced into group work, networking, any kind of connectivity among people. They both were thinking about personal productivity. How did all that happen?
So I think there is something about Jobs and Gates here. So when Jobs was kicked out of Apple and started Next, he gave an interview when he said, I saw three things at the Xerox PARC. I saw the GUI, I saw object-oriented programming, Smalltalk, and then I saw Ethernet networking. And I was so blinded by the first one that I forgot about the other two. And so we focused on that at Next. And so one of the things that it usually, you can find it on YouTube, but one of the demos of Steve Jobs that is not very famous because it's not very glamorous, but one of the best one is actually Steve Jobs at Next, just after they stopped commercializing hardware, called interpersonal computing, which describes exactly that, like how a computer is a window towards something, and that window can be shared with someone else. But we've also lost other metaphors. Like, for example, one of my main culprits with today multiplayer software like Figma or Google Doc, which are in themselves very good products, is that they completely lean into the what you see is what I see metaphor. Like, you have to be on the same canvas. We have to share the same documents. That's not how creative work or productivity happens. Like, usually, the creative people will kind of work in a secluded workspace with all their stuff, all their resources, all their material, and then share a definite artifact. And so one of the metaphors developed at PARC that we also lost, what's called what you see is almost what I see, which means that we should be able to have several pointers to different places in a file. And to me, that problem also comes from the fact that users, because of those metaphors, are completely mixing window, files, and apps. And especially now, as we go towards more and more integrated software, like, for example, Figma is completely self-contained into one window. You have the pane, the file explorer, everything is inside one window. Whereas a file should be kind of like email. You should be able to choose an app that would display a file in a different manner. And you, as the user, should be able to set the parameters. That's completely impossible today with the file structures we have. We have to do away with the files. And as we move ahead with more and more cloud storage, it's going to become a larger and larger problem.
I had a wish list software item years ago that I called Linkido, sort of a neologism, a blend of link management and Aikido. And the idea was, it dawned on me one day that I was using 8 different text editors. And back then it might have been Outlook, Word, PowerPoint, Blogger, something. I don't remember what it was, but I counted 8. And they each had different kinds of commands and different ways of embedding things. And this was before Command K was a general way to embed a URL and stuff like that. They had
not meaningfully different, I assume.
Yes,
different.
Exactly. And cut, copy, paste was standard because that had sort of won the day there, which is a keyboard miracle. Like the one useful thing that came out of the QWERTY keyboard for me is cut, copy, paste on the keyboard, maps so nicely to characters that are memorable. But in Linkido, I was like, how about if you floated the editor, your favorite editor? You get to pick. If you're an Emacs person, then it's Emacs. If you like something else, you float your favorite editor above all apps. And the only difference between an email and a web page is that one of them says, send this to this person, and the other one says, put this over here. That's it. And if we assume a lingua franca like HTML++, whatever that might have been back in the day, then all these things become interchangeable, and then any message, any nugget becomes promotable, demotable, forwardable, copyable. It suddenly becomes this really flex little object in the middle of people trying to do work together.
And I just to complete that, I think this is where we have to be very careful as designers. Because if you look at what you said, there are 2 ways to interpret that. And the 2 ways are actually speaking about the same thing. The underlying concept is the document-oriented paradigm, which is that instead of calling an app, you are calling something to edit something else, like a palette to edit a text, another palette to edit an image. And if you look at what Jeff Raskin was saying, if you do that in the same software, you are going to create what he calls modality with a vengeance, because you are going to have one software, so one thing that is very kind of monolithic, that is going to act in entirely different ways according to the content you click on. That's kind of how Notion operates with integrations, tables, text. You create a block, and the block will call something to edit it. And you kind of know once you created a way around the software, like once you've mastered it, how it works. I think that the best way to do that is to actually say, here is the data pool, here is the object, and you choose the viewer you want. And you have a choice of several viewers. Like, we do not have to do away with everything. We do not have to throw Windows away. We do not have to throw apps completely away. We have to make apps viewers for an underlying data and to add contextual information in each viewer.
Just to build on what you said briefly, and then I'll throw it to you, John. One of the things that's been bubbling up a lot in these conversations around tools for thinking is that there are a variety of different tools for thinking. They serve different purposes. Like Kumu is really great for system flow diagrams, and I can't do that in the brain, but you can't use Kumu to do the stuff that I do in the brain, and Rome is good for something else. So there's this idea of pivoting, or there's like liminal spaces between what different tools are good at that we should be able to sort of seamlessly move between, so that we could choose our viewer or application on the same data, but as what we're trying to get done shifts, we could shift the tools and then share that view with somebody else or whatever else.
Exactly.
I mean, I think we're jointly onto something really good here, and it's not like we're the first people to come upon this, but the idea of inverting the relationship between content and manipulatory tools, where we're very much in a manipulatory tools equals app mindset today. But if instead, as you started to propose, Jerry, and I think this is probably a lot of what Kosmik does, but I haven't gotten my beta invitation yet, so I don't know. But like, if we imagine arraying all of the stuff, the data, the goods, in a spatial way, then viewers, editors, applications, whatever we want to call them, are more like dirigibles, because I think we need to get back to blimps in everything we do that float above this landscape, if we want to be 2D about it, and give you kind of a way to peer down on some region of it. The particular characteristic of that model that is especially exciting to me, because I have very narrow range of interests and a big idée fixe, is that in this way, that window or application or editor or whatever it is also becomes a metaphor, but also a literal representation for attention. And in a world where there's collaboration, if we share some region of landscape, there's some overlap between our files, our data, our documents, whatever they are. Then if I pull back far enough, I can see that, Jerry has his text plus link plus image editor kind of hovering above this region, which is not of any interest to me at the moment, but I can see which way it's drifting. But I know that Alex is actually right on top of a thing that I've been working on. And so, this is one of the things that's really easy for digital systems to do, and no one's ever done it commercially, which is to depict attention, depict human cognition.
So I think, just to add to that, it goes back to one of the notions that also Jeff Raskin advocates for, which is that he thinks that we are mixing two different ways of the mind to focus his attention. One is focus, and the other is locus. And the locus, L-O-C-U-S, is how you fix your attention on a geographical point and how a UI should embody that concept. And that's exactly what you're describing, John. Like, we have to, today we can focus, like we have full screen apps, we have stuff like that, but it's becoming like, today, window management in macOS 10 is, I would argue, way worse than in macOS 9. Like, a lot of the productivity work that we have to do is actually becoming more difficult and harder to create and to maintain. And so I completely agree with that vision, but it comes back to that idea, like, we have to destroy the idea of a hierarchical file system, even in terms of how we develop software. Like, it's going to become a problem if we want to advance.
There's also a weird thing with Apple software in general. It's like every version of iMovie is worse than the last one. Every version of iTunes seems worse than the last one. I don't use most Apple software because they seem to just be bouncing down the hill.
So I think it comes from the fact that it's an old debate at Apple that almost killed HyperCard. Actually, HyperCard was almost completely killed by Jean-Louis Gasset, who was the French guy that took over the R&D at Apple when Steve Jobs got kicked out. And he was like, if we allow HyperCard to be sold with every Mac, we are going to completely frighten every third-party developer, because people will just make software on their own Macintosh, and they will create their own software. And also, hypercard is not consistent with the metaphors of the Mac. But that's another subject. But I think that Apple is still kind of circling around that problem of they have to create software as a first party for their platform, for the hardware, to kind of showcase what it can do, but at the same time, they just do not have those resources, and they do not want to kind of kill the market that should sprung up naturally from the App Store. And if you look at the iLife and iWork suite that were distributed with the Mac during, I don't know, 2002 to until maybe 2009 or 12, they were actually really good. And it kind of went downhill as the App Store took more and more importance.
Did you say they don't have the resources?
I know it sounds funny, but I've spoken with some people in the thing, and they told me that yes, they have a lot of problems, and they just do not have enough developers to maintain everything they do, which seems very. Yeah, I think like maybe they have, maybe it's a problem of process, maybe it's a problem of tools. Like, have you used Xcode recently? Like, really, it's hard. Like, we do Kosmik is a native app for the Mac and the iPad, and I'm super proud of that. But we have to fight the frameworks to make it work.
Well, my next question was going to be, can you tell us more about WonderOS and sort of the explorations you're into in the context of what we've been saying here?
We've been talking a lot about kind of the new models that we want to apply to kind of existing systems, or how we might reify those new models in existing systems, how we might fill the liminal spaces, how we might have this universal preferred text editor that kind of floats up, right? But what I've done with my work is one of my friends calls it the burn it all down approach, which once he said that, I was like, wait, what do you mean? But he was right. Like, it's what I've done in my work is approach it as, okay, scrap it all, start anew, pretend like nothing exists, and you don't need to integrate with anything that exists today. And what would it be like, right? So that's kind of the context that I implicitly put on the sort of the design challenge I gave myself, and continue to. So what that ends up looking like is a lot of the things that we've said today so far, but without a lot of the challenges that it would take to force them into today's software. So, for example, one of the biggest things that I've explored with my work and what WonderOS is an itemized OS. So the idea is that your operating system is made entire, and we're talking about the user environment, right? The entire user environment is made of items. And so we have some pretty clear ones: web page, email, that's an item, that's an item. Items are made of other items. So a to-do list item is made of to-do items. And so when and items can be in, a bunch of other items. So then you end up with a graph. So now you've got an itemized graph of things. And items are strictly data. That's it. They can't do stuff on their own. So it's just data. And then and items, that data is separate from the services that supply them, if they were supplied rather than created, and separate from the interfaces that render them. So when you have an item open, you can you can swap the view that you're using to render it. If you prefer to compose your emails in Markdown, you can swap to your Markdown view, right? And then services are the only way to get data in from the outside world. And so that's how you break the notion of an app. If you could ship one contained thing that glues the interface with the service, with the data, then people just are going to ship apps, right? But that's not what we collectively decided here is right for the user model. And so in that kind of burn it down approach, what you burn it down, you let go of everything legacy. It seems like there are plausible answers to the questions that we're asking. And when you really start to tinker with them, it makes you think, "Ooh, I really want to let go of the computer I have today and pick up something completely new."
I think what you said is very interesting, is the notion of services, which is one of the best notion in Unix operating systems, which is that you can act from wherever you are on the US on the OS on something.
And Unix is just a big bag of utilities that happen to work together politely. They are pipeable, composable, rearrangeable. Unix is really just a bag of utilities, and nobody sort of understands that, well, except for people who love Unix.
Agree. And I just thought of something, which is that the creators of Unix at some point worked on an OS that almost had the metaphors that John was talking about earlier, which is Plan 9. I don't know if you know about that OS, because it's really kind of in the weeds of computing history. But Plan 9 was actually very fun, because you basically drew a window with the cursor, and that window could contain anything, including another instance of itself. So you could create workspace in that way, and you could have multiple workspaces pointing at multiple layers of data. And it was actually, I think, probably one of the best way to anticipate the future, and just to also lean into those kind of metaphors that weren't kind of that haven't been very popular. It's so bizarre that we still do not have what Ted Nelson called transpointing windows, which is a window that can have a link that goes out of the window region into another window to point at a piece of content that is represented in two places. It would make our life so much easier. And we have aliases on our desktop, especially Windows user. Since like 30 years, we should have transpointing windows. Like it should be a basic stuff in the UI of every OS and every app.
So two items of trivia regarding Plan 9. I think it was named after the bad science fiction movie Plan 9 from Outer Space, back from 1957. And it was Ken Thompson and Rob Pike, I think, at Bell Labs busy doing that.
Yes.
People who like are in the pantheon of computing pioneers. And I think it's Thompson and Ritchie who do other things. And like there's this nexus, there's this golden era of Bell Labs that's worth looking back into, just like Xerox PARC, for all of the things that were kind of fruiting out of all the people who were there collaborating. And you know, then Jobs is trying to emulate the architectural characteristics of Bell Labs so that he can generate more productivity at Apple and all that. It's like, such complicated histories we weave. So now back to our regularly scheduled program, which is already in progress.
Well, I guess, it occurs to me we've generated a really enticing sack of desirable characteristics or functionality. Should we talk about data structures that would enable them?
Yes, and two things. The enemy here seems to be either managers or developers' fear of humans. That people will be terrified, as you said with Gasset and HyperCard. Like, there's no way people will be terrified of this, but also fear that humans will go do something useful and productive together, and all the coders that we need to make software for the Mac won't actually code for the Mac because they'll be like, just bake HyperCard into the OS and just use HyperTalk, right? Go crazy with that.
And just before we talk about data structure themselves, HyperCard was originally a project to make an OS for a Mac tablet. Like it was a full self-contained thing to be run on a MacBook.
And Atkinson had to blackmail Apple. He had to threaten Apple to bundle it with the Mac. He basically said, if you don't do this, I'm going to just put it out openly.
Yeah, so he had a meeting with John Scully, and John Scully loved it. And Alan Kay was at the meeting and really pushed for HyperCard to be with the Mac. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Alan Kay was also one of the main drivers beyond the whole HyperTalk integration to HyperCard, because we speak about HyperCard, but the magic of HyperCard is the language. And I think even today, we do not have a language with such a humane syntax, like the way HyperTalk can be discovered by the user, used, and to go from I draw to I add an interactive thing, which is a button or a text field, to I script that thing to make it do other things, was so progressive. It's really like,
I mean, I think it's
cool.
really, really hard at this moment, actually, not to invoke Orwell, right? The proscription against literacy only ever has one aim. And I think it actually, HyperCard's tenuous life and death circumstances got even more acute when the iPad came out. And I thought it was such a loud message from Apple to say, there will be no programming languages. I remember Scratch had a huge battle early on, right, with the tablet, which was going to be an important platform for it because you weren't allowed to have languages on the device. So that, that sort of speaks volumes.
It's crazy too, because Scratch and Smalltalk, all these things have common ancestry. All these things kind of lump back together, and there's this struggle by brilliant people like Dave Reed and a bunch of others who have worked on these projects forever and get marginalized. Like these power tools don't make it into the general sphere. And some piece of this conversation, and I don't want to take us in that direction, is about how do you strategize getting this into like full public use? How do you get a community that does, and I don't mean what's the business model that gets this out and successful, because in many cases we don't need a business model. I know that many years ago when Microsoft's laptop tax or OS tax got broken, so computer makers started being able to ship a computer that didn't have to license the Mac OS, even if they weren't going to put the Mac OS on it. I was talking to the inventor of the Brain saying, like, if you had a version of the Brain that ran on Linux, you could basically take advantage of Linux distros and roll the Brain out as the UI. And wouldn't that be kind of cool? Because the alternatives are KDE and GNOME, and those sucked. They were like lousy replicas, as far as I could tell, of the desktop metaphor, right? And wouldn't it be cool if anybody who went down that path had a completely different experience of their existence in the OS? And the Brain does 1/15th or 1/100th of the kinds of features and functionalities you guys have been describing. So it wouldn't have given us anything like the all singing, all dancing item world that you're describing, Alex. But there seem to be these market opportunities or movement opportunities, and it feels like we're also at a moment right now where we need to level up this whole thing. And this important thing that's coming out of the Tools for Thinking conversations is, hey, we could talk about this cool tool or that cool tool or this cool tool or that cool tool, but really, if we want to think together and if we want to make this thing work, we need to level up our thinking about the OS, the databases, everything that we're talking about here. Sorry to maybe state the obvious, but that's really sort of crystallizing in my head and rising in importance in this whole quest.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Well, I guess we're done then.
Part of the actual manifestation of such circumstances, it seems to me, would have to involve a kind of vigorous, almost rabid community feature. And I wonder if, bizarre as it is, there's anything to be learned from TikTok, Twitter, like sort of massive, sort of bell curve shape. Well, I don't know, like it's probably some sort of exponential thing instead, but like communities where there is enormous participation, a lot of it is in consumption mode, but there's never not the opportunity to dive in a little bit. And then there are people who are incredibly productive on those platforms. But if instead of creating video content or little textual idea mini nuggets, it were bits of data, bits of code, bits of overlap, bits of kind of knowledge auto connecting or being guided to connect, to start forming enormous rafts of knowledge floating out in the Pacific, to get a little Gibson up about it.
We don't want to gyre though.
It's the anti-jack.
I agree.
Exactly.
I think building a community of content creators at the start who really get the system, can help shape the system, and kind of help advocate for it out. I totally agree. I think that would be like the key cornerstone to get adoption for something completely new.
So that's kind of what we are leaning on to try to kind of summarize all of what you said, and including and especially the distribution and the problematic aspect of the business model. Like when we started designing Kosmik, we were like, we towards the object, and we do not want to duplicate those objects. We want to do away with the file metaphor, so everything's going to be stored in a data pool. So we used IPFS, and so we cross-compiled IPFS. We made it run on the iPad, the iPhone, the Mac, everywhere to have a local node. And then on top of that, we created the database that does what we think would be, should be baseline for every new file system in 2022, which is having the ability to collaborate not on the document, but at the object level, having authorship tracking, having transclusion, having cryptographic key for each object and the graph separately in different containers, and a way to do what we call polymorphous data, which is that once you have that kind of superstructure of the file system. So you have immutable data in IPFS, which means that each time you add a new data, you add a new thing in that file system. On top of that, you add polydata, which will allow your data to be different. That, to me, is how we get to that point where in Kosmik, for example, you have a text. We read the text from IPFS, and on the canvas, we add the polydata to say, here is the position on the canvas, and here is the width and the height. And then here is another polydata, which is where is the bold in the text or where is the underline. But let's say we succeed and Foundation becomes an SDK. You take that data structure, because Kosmik already has thousands of users, you build on top of that ecosystem, and you build an outliner or a new text app for Jerry to have only one text editor. And what you are going to do is you say, I'm an independent developer, but I want to do that app, but I need the community. I want users to beta test it. What you can do is you say, I'm going to use Kosmik data structure Foundation, and I'm also going to use their ID mechanism, which means that when you do introduce your app, people can log in with the same credentials as Kosmik. But what's going to happen is that your text editor will just ignore all the polydata that it doesn't need, like the size and the position of the object. But what's super cool is because of transclusion, what we call magic copy in the software. When you modify your text here in the new text editor for Jerry, it's also going to show up in the canvas. Yeah. And so that's how we hope it's going to work out, by saying, hey, here's the way you can build new apps that have those baseline features, which is ownership of the data, authorship tracking, security with encryption, local first, offline first, multiplayer, everything, infinite versioning, all of that is in there. But when you do come out with an app with 0 users, you can actually talk to all those users that are already on Kosmik, and they may just try it and add it to their suite of apps. So if I may make another kind of 1990s reference, it's kind of an open source Claris, if you remember Claris, which was a way for Apple to I think it's a clearly understudied model to say, we have a platform, we need good software for that platform, so we are going to edit some parts of that ecosystem ourselves. But if we do stumble upon a very good indie software, we can just bring him in-house and edit it with a logo that customers will trust and recognize. That's kind of how we want to do it. And so it's going to be very hard, very long. It has a lot of problems, because when you speak with an investor, for example, how do you tell him that it's coherent for you to start with a spatial canvas for spatial thinking, but you are going to end up with a platform because what you actually needed to build that in order for the canvas to do the things you wanted to do? And the best way is probably to maybe separate the two and have kind of a non-profit or another type of organization that takes care of that underlying platform.
I'm excited. I just want to figure out how to help roll these things out, how to make them work.
Just to complete very quickly, that's the problem that you were speaking about earlier with the current tool for thoughts. If you want to have interoperability, you have to use Obsidian, for example. But then you have interoperability because you use a legacy system, which is Markdown files, which means that you cannot have all the niceties that you have in Rome Research or that you have in Dynotno, Newkid on the Block Tana, for example. But then, what if, for example, but then if you do not create a data structure that takes care of all the things I just announced and spoke about, it's very hard to bake them into your data structure afterwards. And so, for example, that's why I think Rome has maybe some trouble just shipping, because that stuff is really hard to build.
So for people who are not up on Obsidian, Markdown, Rome, and all that, and without explaining what Markdown is, let's assume that away, could you slow that down to like 20 miles an hour and just say that again? Because it's really important, and it's a very specific example of the problem, the thorny problem that all these tool makers are facing.
Yeah, you mean the interoperability problem. So yeah. To me, the problem is that, so interoperability means that you can do what is called in the Web3 realms cross-pollination, which is basically the idea that you can have a file that you are going to open in several apps to enrich it, or that because you use a legacy file format like Markdown, which is a text file format, you can just say, I'm going to use Obsidian, but if I don't like the tool anymore, I can just take that very common file system, file structure, and open it somewhere else, and it's going to work out just fine. That works, but it means that you restrict yourself as a user to a set of features that is not very advanced. Like doing collaboration is very hard, doing encryption is very hard, doing synchronization between devices is very hard, doing versioning is very hard. Or you have to rely on the file system, which is another set of problems. And so if you look at the other tools that do have very advanced features like Rome, Notion, Tana, and the other one, they use completely closed data structures. And I'm certain, and I've spoken with some of the people in those companies, that they have problems with their data structures because they have to be built on legacy tools. Like, for example, to use Firebase to do a transclusion-based data structure is asking for problems. So at some point, we have, as designers and developers, to say, we are going to rip the Band-Aid and we have to start clean with a data structure that will be completely open source, that anybody can build upon, but that takes those features that we want as just the baseline. And then each one will be able to fork or build or do something else. And we are not the only ones advocating for that. And actually, there are a bunch of other projects and systems that are very well advanced, like what Fission is doing, for example, with their web native file system, or what Gordon Brander is doing with Noosphere and Subconscious. Like, those are very interesting projects. What we hope to do with the Kosmik data structure is to really make an SDK to build new apps, which is a bit different, because I do believe in apps as viewers to act on the data.
That was awesome. Thank you, Alex, John. Anywhere you'd like to go?
Well, I guess there's a subtle distinction, I think, if I understand correctly, Paul, and please redirect me, but between the idea of open sourcing access to data as a necessary first step to making things universally interoperable, and then the downstream problem of translating and rendering interoperable different different compound data structures that enable different features. So, like, there will be plenty of applications, even in that world, even in the Foundation plus IPFS world, plus Kosmik world, that still want to use Markdown. But, what about like Ian Neal's Codex OS standoff properties thing, right? So there's still, I don't want to say an incompatibility, but there's still a translation problem, even when all of the underlying access mechanisms are open. And maybe there's the opportunity for a kind of meta schema self-description mechanism that can sort of
exactly
ease the translation.
So it could be very, very technical, and I don't want to cut Alex too long, but so it's actually how it works in the Kosmik database. And we did something that's really fun, which is that usually in a graph database, you have objects that are connected to other objects by edges. And what we did in Kosmik is that the edges themselves are objects. So you can inject any kind of new data into those and actually say, oh, I want standoff properties. Let's just add that in the edge itself, which also means that you could add code and run code not on the object itself, but above, which is how, for example, and this is a completely different issue, but I think it's going to be very, very, very troublesome in the next few years. Today, we have a bunch of startups, a bunch of companies that are just plugging AI models in their product. They don't know who trained the model. They don't know how they were trained, and they don't know how to really handle that. We could do distributed computing by just injecting a lot of data into a Kosmik canvas and have something run into the edge of all of those images to train a new model in a decentralized way. So I think it's not only a new cool way to address some problems, it's actually going to be needed, because if AI becomes as prevalent as it looks it's going to be, we need, as the community of users, to be able to train the data sets and to have models that we know are biased, but at least we know why and how they are biased.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we take that graph to the system scale, if we imagine a Kosmik OS, if you will, I think sometimes people hear graph and they get kind of just an abstract notion in their heads. But if you take that graph to the system scale, it's this meta system that's running on all your devices. There are some really cool things that happen where, so for example, like today, when you have a notification show up on the front door of your device, on your lock screen, right? Notifications pop up because an app has code that was written to say, all right, put this notification on this person's home screen. You as a user get to decide, yes, this app is allowed to post all of its notifications, or no, this app cannot post any of its notifications, right? That's your total agency in the situation, right? Once we have this, we've got this graph. we can set up, notifications as sort of automations that run triggered by, say that the new presence of an item or the change to an item, that kind of thing. But because of the graph, we can do really things that will seem ridiculously obvious and simple in the future, but now are completely impossible. So for example, emails. You don't want to get a notification on your home screen of every single email you receive, right? Those days are gone. There's just too much junk coming in. It's a fire hose. So you start with your notifications off and you're in your graph, right? Then you want to set up a notification to say, okay, when my spouse emails me, yes, notify me every time immediately. I want that on my home screen. I want that no matter what's happening, I want to see it, right? But you can start to do really interesting things because of the graph, where you can just say, okay, if I get an email from someone that I'm currently in a meeting with or about to be in a meeting with, hit me with the notification of that. If I get an email from the website that I'm currently on, notify me of that, right? Covers all of these use cases. Someone saying they're late, someone sending you a meeting agenda right before the meeting or the Zoom link, covers, the website sending you a discount because you just signed up, your magic sign-in links, like all of these things. And so then you haven't turned on notifications for all of your emails. But you get to do these little, and your system has all this information in it. It knows what meeting you're in. It's an event. It's that item is associated with the contacts of the people who are in it. So you can set up these automations for user-defined notifications, which is how notifications should work, based on all the items in your graph. And it will seem very simple and obvious, and people will look back on today and laugh at how quaint our rigid systems were.
We used to have to start cars by turning a crank out in front of the car.
Airplanes
So
too.
it feels so often with software today.
Yeah, totally.
And I think there is something else with that with those data structures that comes back to the iPad, the iPhone, the Mac, and basically any ecosystem today which relies on a lot of devices. Yeah, so basically I think that we are going to live in a world where you want to not only switch contacts between devices, but you want to use your devices concurrently for several tasks. For example, one cool use case with Spatial Canvas is that you can draw on the tablet while you write text on the Mac, stuff like that. Very hard to do with our file system that we have today. It's not well designed for that. And you can imagine how having a collection of devices could help you in several contexts. Like you could have someone in a VR headset, and so the poly data structure would have coordinates for the 3D system, or you could be on a 2D spatial canvas, and on and on and on. So it's also needed to kind of enhance the experiences we have today, because if you look at how a Mac and an iPad works today, there are nice things, but beyond AirDrop, which has kind of that magical feeling of a file flying between the devices, nothing is that cool. Like pages look exactly the same, mail look exactly the same, and it's not that like it should do much more, because the iPad is a different device than the Mac, or the Surface is a different device than my desktop PC. And it goes back to another thing, which is that if we do that, we could have what I would call, I don't know if that's the right term in English, kind of destined computer that are made for one tasks. Like, because you would have that common data structure that would be somewhere on a central CPU, a central server that could be in your home because it's decentralized. You could have a computer to draw with very different brushes and inks and stuff like that. And you would be able to draw at that computer, but then you could have a computer for music, but then you could have a computer to write, and then you could have your laptop because you still need a general purpose computer. But I think it's also one of the other problems. The computer today does too much things, and maybe we need what Jeff Ruskin was also calling information appliances.
Mm-hmm.
Devices that are designed for specific tasks and that are very good at those tasks. Sometimes you need to have a jack of all trades. But I do feel and think that also there are a lot of contexts where you would benefit from having something that is very designed with a very specific and narrow usage in mind, because it would be better at that task.
That's also the key out of this whole always having to be tethered to the cloud and your data always going to the cloud problem. Because if you've got your personal computing network, your video camera on your doorbell is on that network, but it can offload the video processing to say your, very expensive, huge, tethered into the wall, battery backed up power computer
sitting idle right now, not doing anything.
Exactly. So you can, once you've got this personal computing network where tasks specific to different devices can be kind of offloaded amongst the things on that network, then you get to have your own personal, everything you need in your network. And so that's one of those keys that would help untether us from this. Oh, well, you have to sign up and subscribe because only our servers can do this thing that you need done, like having your video streaming all the time, which is a major privacy issue.
This call just keeps bringing up things that have been pet peeves or irritations for me for over the years, and all the examples and the things we've pointed to as historic examples, whether it's Xerox Star or Claris or whatnot. I'm like, wow, and even the example of I do not know how to make my Android phone send me everything my wife wants to send me and nobody else. Like I cannot make it do that. It isn't working. And that's just like a very simple task, you would think, right? And part of this is sort of blunders in design at the OS level. There's I think part of what we're saying here is that you need to unpack how many places something went wrong that make that hard to do, hard to code. And then you need to leap over and say, how do we jump over into a green field and do something different? And I'll say that I've been fortunate and a little unlucky in my life to run into several geniuses who had invented something in a green field that was never obvious, that was just never going to make it to market. And there's a fellow named Sandy Klausner who invented a system called Cubicon that basically was soup to nuts from hardware all the way up to reinventing the web and networking and everything else. He was not a coder. He was just a brilliant person. He designed it all in Director. And then there was one point at which the Mac changed the screen resolution from either squares to rectangles or rectangles to squares. I don't remember, but there was this huge shift in how Mac rendered pixels on screen. Director, he had drawn 9,000 diagrams in Director to explain Cubicon, none of which worked in the new rendering. So then for years he had to buy old Macs and keep them alive in order to do his rendering. Right? And I'm like, wow. And he was busy trying to convince Intel or other companies, hey, if only you do this. And when you looked at it, it was like he was asking us to have precogs bathed in a nutrient solution with a jack in the back of their heads in this new system. It was so foreign to whatever existed today, right? It was just, it was too far ahead. And what we're talking about here is not that. I'm not trying to paint it with that. I'm trying to say this seems so pragmatic and so doable, but we have other market failures, which are, this fear of humans and the competitive problems and the occasional character who stops a great idea cold out of one of these kinds of fears.
So maybe that's why we have to start small. Just as the Mac was kind of a miniature Xerox Star, retailing for a quarter of the price, and it still had kind of some troubles making inroads at the beginning. But I think that's maybe how you can try to do it at least. You start with something very, very simple. That's like, oh, now you can just pull out an image from the website, and that image knows that it comes from the website, so your research workflow is better. But people don't care about all the machinery that's down there. But then gradually you can expose it by better features, more complex programs, and going down that path. But it's very hard, but I think it's doable.
Agreed. And I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but both of you, what paths do you imagine for Kosmik and Wonder to get in the world? And how do we help? And how do I become part of this posse of people, building the original community? One of my goals in life is to take the data that I've poured into the brain for 25 years, drop it in the commons, and use it as a sourdough starter or as a mycelial inoculation into the global brain. I'm dying to do that, but I don't know what to inoculate, where to put it, and how to share it out with other people. I would love to do that.
Yeah, so when you burn it all down and paint a completely new picture, how do you then connect the dots from the present to that future? I think for something like Wonder OS, which is very much just a research project, certainly at least at this stage, and a very janky one at that, but a delightfully janky one. I with that project in particular with WonderOS, it starts as an alternative user environment, one that doesn't do nearly as much as it should, but does do some things and does those exceptionally well, and offering you agency and increasing creativity and your curiosity and your opportunity to engage with the digital things of your world and map your thoughts, onto these external digital surfaces, which should be better than the physical surfaces, and yet half of the time you're going to reach for physical surfaces today because it's just going to be easier, which that's horrifying, right? Like, these screens are like completely limitless canvases. We can put anything on them we want, and yet we haven't figured out these how to reify these primitives with which we think and speak with one another, into digital worlds. Sorry, you can get me on a tangent on that stuff any day of the week. So WonderOS, it starts as an alternative user environment for an existing computer, and you boot up that alternative user environment and you bash around, hit the walls a good bit, and when you hit walls, that's when you realize, okay, outer space needs to expand here in this spot. And you keep expanding that alternative user environment, and then at some point you start to ask kind of the bigger questions of when does the user environment then expand into other things.
Love that. Thank you. Paul?
So I think we are going to try that idea with Kosmik, which is what we started to do, which is, hey, here's a spatial canvas that can do great things. Like, for example, you can create a mood board in minutes instead of hours, or you can browse the web in a new way, which will make your research workflow better. And we target it at very, very specific user segments, like interior designers, developers, researchers, like very, very narrow. And a few companies are already asking us, like, can I use that software? Because I feel that it would be a better alternative than Miro or Mural or FigJam, for example, or other products in that category, because we need something that's richer, something that can also enable this new way of collaboration that doesn't need everybody at the same time in the same room, if you will. So I think, like, I had a talk with an investor about that right before the podcast, and he was like, you have to have chapters, and chapter 1 is a single user web browsers for creative people, and that's already quite a lot. Then you make it multiplayer and it becomes a collaboration tool for visual thinkers. And then once you've done that, you'll probably have GRU, and you will have a database or you will have a user base that's quite large. You will have revenues. Then you can open the third chapter, which is, hey, by the way, it was built on that since the beginning. That thing foundation is now available to everybody that wants to build on top of that, and we can actually help you. So the only thing is that I still believe that I need to, get that message out there right now, and kind of have that master plan in the open of, hey, I know we're at chapter 1, but I'm really working to go to chapter 3. So here's how it's going to work, and you can follow the journey here. So that's kind of how we hope to do it. And honestly, I think it's a 24 to 36 months adventure to get to the beginning of chapter 3.
Wow. Yeah, makes total sense. I'm reminded of a story about the Wright brothers, because I read one of their biographies, and they had a 10-year lead on everybody else. They figured out pitch, yaw, and roll. They invented the wind tunnel. They like when they flew their plane, other people were basically putting one of these early motors on top of a wing and shoving it down a ramp and saying, hope it's going to fly. And a little bit better than that. But the Wright brothers kind of sourced it all out. And then the Wright brothers reporters started coming out and filming them flying. They were afraid of losing their IP. And then they wasted 10 years trying to sell this aircraft to armies, none of which bought their airplane until Lewis put the rudder in the back, and then they bought Lewis's airplane. But the Wright brothers basically lost this gigantic lead they had on how aerodynamics actually work. And so I'd like to sort of skip that here and figure out what are the fruitful dynamics. And I think they're showing up in the conversation here of getting this in general use, starting with chapters, starting with something that people can understand, but not dumbing it down so much that we've like snipped away what the actual utility is, because that's what tends to happen here, is that we're so afraid people won't understand something new that we just like shave it back to nothingness, right?
So I think it comes down to, how do you speak to different communities? Like, how do you give Kosmik to designers or developers, and then at the same time explain, oh, by the way, the magic in that spatial canvas, here's how it works, and for you developers, here's what you can do with it. And another thing that goes back also to what you were saying about the right browsers is that I think that in startups and tech in general, we are way too worried about competition and IP. Like, nothing's going to happen. Like, those ideas are very large. They've been around for some of them for 60 years. Like, transpointing windows were designed in 1974, and we still do not have them. So that's also why when someone's an investor or developer, someone tells me, why would you like to open source your most valuable thing? And I'm like, because it's going to be more valuable if it's out in the open and other people are using it than if I just keep it for myself to build my small software that will maybe one day be a 10 million user base. Like, it can be for 1 billion people, for maybe more, but and it will generate value because it is powering other things. And that's how I think it should work. Like, we should not speak about how to protect that. We should speak about how to distribute that. Like, it's always a distribution issue.
And a thing that funders don't seem to appreciate is that, or maybe this is inventors don't seem to appreciate, is that the open source strategy is a great defensive strategy for keeping something in the world. Because as soon as it's proprietary and something goes wrong, somebody else ends up owning it and you don't get to work on the thing that you developed your whole life. I don't know anybody who's been through that who might be in this room, but
and I think that's another answer, another solution, part of the solution to the problem that you raised. I love that it's what Paul's doing with Kosmik. They're starting with, even though they're targeting specific use cases, they're building them on those core fundamental primitives. It's the harder path to take. It certainly takes infinitely longer. Paul will admit to that.
Yeah.
But they're building those specific use cases on the core primitives, on the database, from the get-go. So even though it seems like, oh wow, this is perfect for this one use case, then he'll be able to pull the curtain off of the other 5 doors and say, well, these primitives apply kind of across the board.
Yeah. And I think on top of all of that, the fantastic instincts that Paul has about open sourcing critical parts of it, the fact, Alex, that you're engaged as an independent researcher, not as a startup, is that we need to synthesize new kinds of human organizational structures that enable, promote, and reward collaboration across heterogeneous types of substructures, whether it's a startup, whether it's a chunk of academia, whether it's one person who's crowdfunded to, undertake critical research, so that the whole thing can kind of move in roughly the same direction. And that stuff doesn't exist. There really is, I think, room for critically important and exciting invention here. Like, all of the old models are by themselves kind of rotting and demonstrably ineffective.
Yeah.
I feel like you're a time traveler from the future who is describing at least a future episode of the Tools for Thinking podcast, and hopefully the world that we're walking into. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
And no, it's just that this is where you can all help, because it's exactly what John said. The problem is not like the tech will get done. It's hard, as Alex said. Like, it probably took us 2.5 years more to build Kosmik this way than it would have taken if we would have just take a Firebase backend and used web technologies. Like, we choose to have a Rust database cross-compiled through WebAssembly with a local IPFS node that works then with interfaces in JavaScript, TypeScript, and Swift. Like, it was horrendous, and I suspect that if some investors has had a very technical view of what was happening inside the company, they would have get frightened. But that didn't happen, and now we have a true moat. But the problem is not the tech. It's how do you create the structure? Is it a foundation? Is it a non-profit organization? Is it another company? Is it a holding company? Where is it? Is it online? Does it have an office? Like, who takes care of it? Who has stakes in it? Is it the people? Is it the other companies? Like, I'm ready to put what we did at Kosmik on foundation somewhere else. But it needs to, like, for example, I know that the company in itself today is structured to handle how to code that thing. Like, we can do it, but it's not structured at all to handle pull requests from the developer community, to handle documentation, to handle open source licensing issues, and all of that. That's where we need help. And that's really what we are trying to, we don't know what we're doing there yet.
And one of the problems here is that the standard model creates centralized behemoths that try to become unicorns. and then you get a single supplier, and then you get a chokehold in the marketplace. And chokeholds are not good for the kind of environment we're describing. You don't really want there to be an Elon Musk or a Mark Zuckerberg who control. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is basically the king of a country that is larger than the populations of India and China combined. No, seriously. Like the average monthly usage of Facebook is larger than the full populations of India and China. And there's this one guy who's like, we'll do this tomorrow. It's just bizarre.
Well, and that translates all the way down to your devices. You have all these little silos on your devices, which take away your agency.
Bingo.
So what we are thinking about with other founders is, let's say we are a VC-backed startup, which in itself also means that we are not as independent as we could be, but we still are. We are thinking of what happens, like we all want that thing to happen. What happens is if we create a foundation, but then we dedicate some of our own resources and we pull them together to the foundation, and we agree that what's pulled in the foundation will be dedicated democratically. Like we will say, hey, here is the part of the data, here are the parts of the database that we need for our products. And someone else will say, hey, here's what I need. I've committed 2 developers, you've committed 2, let's vote on which one we do first. And we know that we have a common goal, but that we need to be very democratic in the way it works. And it's going to be hard, but it's also maybe the only way to prove to the outer world that nobody inside that company or foundation will become that king. Because that's exactly also one of the most, I would say, block to the adoption of new technology, which is to say, they say they are open source, but are they really?
How is what you just described different from an open source foundation today? A regular one, when we can point to dozens of them.
It's not that different. It's just on a smaller scale. Maybe what's different is that it would be early stage or early to late stage startups banding together with competing products in the marketplace on the front end, but common objectives on the back end. That's to me would be, that's fun, because what I love about the tool for thoughts ecosystem in terms of startups is that we all have competing products that are sometimes very close, but we still exchange ideas very, very freely because we're like, they've been here for so many years that we are obviously going to diverge at some point, and we aren't going to, like, no one is going to eat the other one right now. Not now, at least. So that would be maybe the new thing, which is to for-profit companies that have very capitalistic motives to make money, to create value for shareholders, banding together and saying, yes, but in the back end, on those very foundational things, we agree that we need them and that we need to create them for personal computing to advance. So we agree to take some proceeds to work on those, because all of our products will get better. And also on that, like, have you seen what's going to happen to Notion with Microsoft Loop? Like, Microsoft is a very interesting company now. They are doing a lot of work that is quite interesting on the Office suite. They came up with a framework that basically enables transclusion between all of the Office apps. And they also took that and created a clone, but an exact clone of Notion called Loop that's not available yet. And you're like, that's too bad, because even if Notion is a $10 billion company, it may well have, they may go down the Slack route, which is that Slack was kind of eaten by Teams, even if Teams was kind of a not as well done product. And so you're like, but what if the Notion data structure would have been completely open source, and there would have been tens and tens and tens of products to build on top of those technologies to make Notion not only a great and beautiful product and startup, but also a new way to build software. And so that's how I think we, as founders and as people that have to create value for the shareholders, that's how we do it. Because by agreeing to open source parts of the thing they pay for, we actually protect their investments, because we pull those things in other areas where they can be built upon, and other company could emerge and sprung from that ecosystem. So that's also, I think, our better defense mechanism against the big companies.
It's funny. I walked into this call not as an architect or anything like that, but in 1976, Niklaus Wirth wrote a semi-famous book called Algorithms plus Data Structures equals Programs, right? And I had kind of this primitive notion of, okay, if we can separate the apps from their data, then we sort of get somewhere, because then we get a lot of the blimp-like behavior that John described and everything else that we've been talking about. Except I was sort of skinnying that down to markdown files on GitHub repos, which is what I'm trying to do right this minute. And that's clearly too simple. that actually it doesn't just properly distribute the data, and it fails on so many other kinds of criteria. So I think telling this story, explaining why and how to go through what we've talked about in this call is vital. And I'd love to be helpful in doing that. I think we can pull together different groups of people who have different kinds of skills in crafting stories, telling stories, animating stories, whatever else. That would be a very fun thing to devote some energy to. And then never mind exploring and then setting up the kind of organization or institution or institutions that you were just describing, Paul, that I think are absolutely necessary for this field to thrive. And I'll just add one more thing, which is I think this field needs to thrive not because tools for thinking are kind of cool and gosh, wouldn't it be great if we had some more of those. I think we're talking about civilization here, because if we can think together better, we can change how science works, how journalism works, how education works, how elections and governance work. All those things if this infrastructure for thinking together is fruitful, then it infects and transforms, a little bit like Ice 9, to put in maybe a dark metaphor, all the other ways that humans are trying to sort things out to make decisions together. And that, to me, is like important work right now.
And that goes all the way back to Engelbart with the mother of all demos, right? So mother of all demos, Engelbart, the inventor of the mouse. But what did he spend the next several decades? It was bootstrapping. It's how do we come together and do what we do collectively better? And that's why, the data structures are so important. These are the things we think with, right? If our tools can literally help us think better, which better data structures help us reflect our thinking and manipulate it in ways that are more intuitive to our minds, then everything we can do better.
Which sounds like we should break into song right about now, but still.
I think our work will not be done as long as people feel a need to have a notebook with them on top of their laptop. This is the goal. We speak about that a lot of times internally. This is actually something that's quite mental. We have those devices, you have a $2,500 MacBook with you, but you still have a Moleskine, because the MacBook will actually do things less well than the Moleskine in a lot of cases. And so that's why we also need new data structures, because it shouldn't be that way.
And we've gone pretty much 90 minutes, which is sort of the length of these calls. I'd love, and it feels like we're sort of adding kind of codas to the conversation. But any other thoughts that we want to put into this conversation before we wrap it? Please jump in.
Sometime, if we get the chance, this would go completely off topic, but John, I would love sometime to ask you a little bit about the mental models behind some of the things you've designed and the ones that you believe are missing from mainstream software today.
Great. Let's all stay connected, and maybe if we play our cards right, Jerry will invite us back for part 2.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
It was really cool.
Yeah, same here. I'm vibing with this whole thing very wonderfully. So thank you very much. Thank you all for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that just might help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in the sector, please knock on BetaWorks' door at betaworks.com. And that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you.